You know, the Maya, it's this enduring mystery, isn't it? This incredible civilization building amazing things in the jungle and then poof, or, well, not quite poof. But the ideas about why their big cities emptied out, they range from solid science to some pretty wild esoteric stuff.
They really do. And for this deep dive, we've gone through a stack of fascinating material just for you. We've got everything from like detailed archaeological digs and climate science papers to, well, some of those more speculative takes that always grab headlines.
Right.
So our mission really is to unpack the most compelling theories for why those great classic Maya cities were abandoned, mostly between the 8th and 10th centuries AD.
And what a civilization we're talking about. I mean, the architecture, the math, the astronomy, that incredible precise calendar, just stunning achievements. Their world during that classic period, roughly 250 to 900 AD, stretched across Mesoamerica, Guatemala, southern Mexico, Belize.
Honduras, El Salvador, too. You got places like Tikal, Copan, Palenque. These were huge, vibrant centers.
Exactly. But it's crucial to say, like you hinted, the people didn't vanish. It was the cities, the big urban cores that were deserted. So let's dig in. What's the first major angle the science looks at?
Well, a really dominant area of research is the environment. Ecological factors, there's a lot of evidence pointing towards really severe, long-lasting droughts.
Okay.
And these droughts were likely made worse by other issues like deforestation and the soil getting worn out. It seems like these things might have interacted in a pretty disastrous way.
Environmental collapse. We hear that a lot with ancient societies. What makes the Maya case so strong?
It's the paleoclimate data, really.
Hmm.
Studies of lake sediments, for example. From Lake Chicancaneb in Mexico, they pulled these cores and found distinct layers of gypsum.
Gypsum, what does that signify?
Gypsum forms when water evaporates intensely. So
Okay.
finding thick layers means it was seriously dry for long stretches. And crucially, these layers date right to that 770 to 1100 AD window, smack in the middle of the terminal classic collapse.
Wow, okay. So direct physical evidence of dryness.
Exactly. And there's more. Pollen analysis from the same places shows a shift. You see less forest pollen and more pollen from, like, weeds. It suggests the vegetation cover shrank significantly during those droughts.
Fewer trees, less rain.
Precisely. And for a civilization relying heavily on rain-fed agriculture, which the Maya largely did, that's devastating. Crop failures would have been almost inevitable.
So just a terrible stroke of bad climate luck.
Well, it might be more complex. There's research, including a 2025 report we looked at, suggesting these droughts weren't random. They found patterns, like bicentennial cycles every couple hundred years, possibly linked to solar activity. So the big drought might have been part of a longer-term climate rhythm.
Huh. Interesting.
And cave deposits back this up, too. Speleothems, that's stalactites and stalagmites from Yoktalam Cave show, a really big drop in annual rainfall, something like 40% right during the 9th century.
40% less rain year after year. That's
Yeah.
hard to imagine coping with. And you mentioned deforestation, too.
Yeah, that's the other side of the coin. To feed large populations and build those amazing cities, especially in areas like the Pukin, they cleared a lot of forest for maize fields and timber.
Makes sense. But it had consequences.
It seems so. It led to soil erosion, washing away the good topsoil, and reducing how much food they could grow long-term. Though, it's not quite that simple everywhere.
Uh-oh.
Well, some research, like at Copan, actually found more tree pollen later on. It suggests maybe some areas managed their resources differently, perhaps more sustainably, or maybe the situation just varied region by region.
So a complex picture, not just one single environmental story.
Exactly. You also have to consider the geology. Much of the Maya lowlands is karst terrain, porous limestone. Water drains through it really quickly.
Right, so they'd be really dependent on consistent rainfall.
Very much so. They were clever. They built terraces and canals to manage water, and that worked for a while. But especially in places like the Poke Hills, where the soil is thinner, constant farming, particularly maize over and over, just wore the soil out.
How do we know that?
Things like phytoliths, tiny plant fossils in the soil, show the dominance of maize. And chemical analysis points to nitrogen depletion, basically nutrient loss. Plus, sediment washing into lakes, like Chinchinab again, increased dramatically by the 9th century, showing the whole watershed was becoming destabilized.
So it's like a feedback loop. Less rain, and the land becomes less able to cope with the rain they do get.
That's a good way to put it. The big cities needed reliable agriculture, and the combination of drought and degraded land made things unsustainable.
A double whammy, yeah.
And drought and deforestation can actually make each other worse. Less forest cover means less moisture returned to the atmosphere, evapotranspiration, which can mean fewer clouds and even less rain locally.
Wow. Did they write about this?
There are hints in the inscriptions. Some mention crop failures, water shortages. There's even a fascinating record from Copan where the ruler commemorates something called a star war during a known drought period. Maybe symbolic, maybe a desperate plea.
A star war that really bridges the gap between the environment and, well, human conflict, doesn't it?
It does. And we see evidence of hardship in human remains, too. Skeletons from inland Yucatan from the 9th century show more signs of nutritional stress, things like lines on tooth enamel from childhood malnutrition. And interestingly, it seems to hit the non-elite harder.
Suggesting unequal access to whatever food was available.
Exactly. Scarce resources often amplify social inequalities.
Okay, so the environmental case is strong, complex, and clearly a major factor. But it wasn't just the environment, right? What about politics and warfare?
Absolutely. That's another huge piece of the puzzle. The late Classic period, especially from about 700 AD onwards, saw a really significant uptick in political instability and fighting between the different Maya city-states.
How do we see that archaeologically?
Well, for one, they started building serious defenses. Like at Aguateca, they built walls stretching 4 kilometers in the 8th century. You don't build stuff like that unless you're expecting trouble. And the inscriptions become more graphic. There's one from Naranjo talking about the burning of a place called Vitsna in 697 AD. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of total war, like targeting the entire population, not just warriors.
Oof, not just capturing rivals, but destroying whole communities.
It looks that way sometimes, and you see it visually too. The famous murals at Bonampak. They show battles, captives being presented, tortured. Warfare was clearly deeply tied into politics and ritual.
So was this level of conflict new, or did it just get worse?
It seems to have intensified and changed character between 700 and 900 CE. Some scholars argue it shifted towards what they call dynastic annihilation, meaning going beyond just defeating a rival king. It involved killing the whole royal family, smashing their monuments, basically erasing their existence and claim to power.
Brutal. Are there examples?
Oh yes. Tikal and Naranjo teamed up to defeat Huacas in 744 CE. They sacrificed the captured king, destroyed monuments. And Dos Pilas seems to have been locked in almost constant warfare from about 760 to 830 before it was finally abandoned. It just shows how pervasive the conflict became.
And this fighting directly led to cities being abandoned.
It seems highly likely it was a major contributor. Big famous centers like Tikal and Copan emptied out during this peak conflict period. Aguateca's abandonment around 810 AD looks very sudden and violent with palaces burned.
Makes sense. Conflict makes places unsafe, hard to live in.
And it disrupts everything else. Trade routes, for instance. Access to important goods like obsidian from El Chayal seems to drop off after 800 CE. That cuts off economic lifelines.
Right, so the fighting wasn't just destructive in itself, it crippled the economy too.
Exactly. And the whole Maya political system, these independent city-states, each with its own divine king, was maybe not well suited to handle this kind of widespread escalating chaos.
It's too fragmented.
Potentially, yes. When dynasties started collapsing and they stopped putting up inscriptions boasting about their power, it suggests authority was breaking down. And think back to the droughts.
Ah, right. If the king is divine but the rains fail and enemies are at the gates.
His legitimacy takes a massive hit. We see inscriptions mentioning vassal cities refusing to pay tribute, or texts talking about lost emblems, symbols of royal authority.
So the environmental crisis and the political crisis fed each other.
It certainly looks that way. And interestingly, after the collapse at some sites, like Dos Pilas, you see commoners actually moving into and using former elite palace areas. A real shift in the social landscape.
A tangible sign of the old order crumbling. Is there physical evidence on bodies like with malnutrition, evidence of violence?
Yes, quite a bit.
Yes.
Studies on skeletons from places like Axuna and Zibel Shaltun show a big jump in trauma around the time of death for men in the terminal classic, something like 38% in one study. We even have direct evidence like a shoulder blade from Ex-Cambo with a flint arrowhead stuck right in it.
No mistaking that.
And patterns of skull injuries suggest face-to-face fighting. Then there are the mass graves found at Cancun around 760 CE. The victims seem to have been bound, killed violently, possibly elite figures caught in power struggles or uprisings.
A very violent end for some. Okay, so environment warfare. What about internal social issues, like class struggles?
That's theory number 3, essentially. Socioeconomic breakdown. It brings in social unrest, maybe driven by inequality and economic problems beyond just trade route disruption.
How would that work?
Well, Maya society was very hierarchical. You had the elites, the kings, priests, nobles, and then the vast majority of commoners who did the farming, the building, paid tribute. The demands on them were huge.
So if times got tough droughts, wars, the pressure could become unbearable.
Exactly. Add scarcity to heavy demands, and you have a recipe for resentment, maybe even open rebellion. We see some archaeological hints like palaces being intentionally burned that might point to revolts against the rulers.
Is there a precedent for that?
There's a parallel, though it's later, from the post-classic city of Mayapan. There, it's thought the drought led to famine, which then fueled civil war and the city's collapse. It shows how environmental stress could ignite social conflict.
And was there clear evidence of inequality?
Yes. Archaeology at places like Karakol suggests elites were consuming a lot more resources, living much better than ordinary households. And we saw the skeletal evidence suggesting elites ate better during hardship. There's even an inscription from Tanina around 840 CE that might imply increased labor demands during a famine.
Asking more from people who have less, not a good strategy.
Rarely is. And the economic disruption was broader, too. We mentioned trade routes for things like obsidian.
Right. Essential for tools and weapons.
And also jade, used for prestige goods. If those networks broke down, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It could cause real economic instability, maybe famine in places reliant on trade, and encourage people to just leave the cities.
Did they have ways to buffer against shocks? Like storing food?
Not really, not on a large centralized scale, it seems. Their reliance on rain-fed farming made them very vulnerable to shocks, whether it was a bad harvest or a disrupted trade route.
So a fragile system in many ways.
In some key ways, yes. We see evidence like the collapse of trade along the major Usumacinta River. Pottery styles become more localized, suggesting less regional interaction. Fancy marine shell ornaments stop being made inland, while coastal trading spots seem to become more important. The whole economic map was shifting.
And did the common people just take it? Or did they push back?
There are signs of what you might call non-elite agency or resistance. Those burned palaces we mentioned at Aguateca and Pudiricimino, they look like targeted attacks on symbols of power. At Ceibal, there's evidence of commoners basically dumping their trash, even broken grinding stones, in what used to be a royal plaza. That's a pretty bold statement symbolically.
Turning a sacred space into a garbage dump. Yeah, that sends a message.
And later, at Mayapan again, the incense burners they made tended to show generic gods, not the specific deified kings you saw in the classic period. Maybe a rejection of that old style of personalized rule.
Fascinating. So it's a mix. Environment pushing people, wars breaking things, and maybe internal tensions boiling over. That feels comprehensive, but then there are the other ideas, the more out there ones.
Right. We should touch on those because they're definitely part of the conversation, even if they lack the scientific backing. These are the more esoteric or supernatural theories.
Okay, like what? Ancient aliens?
That's probably the most famous one, Ericson Denikin, Chariots of the Gods. His big claim was King Pakal's sarcophagus lid at Palenque. He said he showed Pakal piloting a spaceship.
Yes, I've seen pictures. It is intricate. But what do archaeologists say?
The mainstream interpretation is completely different. It's seen as a very complex but very Mayan depiction of Pakal falling into the underworld, Xibalba, at the moment of death. It fits perfectly with their known cosmology and art style.
So no spaceship?
Not according to the experts, no. And similar claims about other carvings or misinterpretations of figures like Quetzalcoatl in the codices as aliens have also been pretty thoroughly debunked by scholars who actually study Maya culture, like Michael Coe. They're intriguing ideas for fiction, maybe, but not supported by evidence.
Okay. What else falls into this category?
There are theories suggesting the Maya didn't collapse, they spiritually ascended.
Oh, or migrated to another dimension.
Right, like they just decided to leave this reality behind.
Something like that.
Yeah.
These ideas sometimes loosely connect to indigenous legends about sacred places having spiritual power, like Siete Orejas Mountain. But it's a huge leap from recognizing spiritual beliefs to claiming interdimensional travel. There's no actual evidence for that kind of interpretation in Maya records.
And the whole 2012 end of the world thing tied into this, didn't it? It did, unfortunately. That date, December 21st, 2012, was simply the end of a major cycle in the Maya long count calendar, the 13th Baktun. Inscriptions, like from Tortuguero, actually talk about it as a time of renewal, associated with a specific deity, Bolan Yoktuku.
Not an apocalypse.
Not at all. Modern Maya communities actually held ceremonies for renewal then. But New Age interpretations kind of grabbed onto it, sometimes mixing my ideas about journeys to the underworld from texts like the Popol Vuh with ideas about other dimensions. Again, there's just no pre-Columbian basis for believing the Maya thought they were going to collectively ascend somewhere else.
So these esoteric theories remain pretty speculative, lacking concrete proof from the Maya themselves. Which brings us back to a really key point you made earlier. The Maya didn't actually vanish.
Exactly. This is maybe the most important takeaway. The collapse was about the abandonment of those specific southern lowland cities. It was not the extinction of the Maya people or their culture.
How many Maya are there today?
Estimates vary, but it's well over 7 million people, maybe closer to 8 million, living across Mesoamerica, Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, and in diaspora communities elsewhere.
7 or 8 million people. That's hardly vanished.
I'm not even close.
Yeah.
And they maintain incredibly rich cultures. There are still over 30 distinct Mayan languages spoken today. People continue traditional farming, weaving, rituals, using their calendar systems. It's a living, evolving culture with deep roots.
So the story is really one of transformation and resilience, not disappearance.
That's a much better way to frame it.
Yeah.
Even archaeologically, we see this wasn't an apocalypse. While the southern cities declined, population shifted. The northern Yucatan saw cities like Chichen Itza actually boom during and after the southern collapse.
So people moved, adapted.
Yes, and even around the abandoned southern cities, recent technology like LIDAR, which can map terrain through forest canopy, has revealed extensive surviving rural settlements. It suggests more of a decentralization, a move away from the big urban model rather than everyone dying or leaving.
And they carried their knowledge with them.
Absolutely. Think about sustainable practices. Today, there are Maya community forestry cooperatives in the Maya Biosphere Reserve, using traditional agroforestry methods, knowledge passed down for centuries.
That's incredible. And the famous calendar, is that still used?
Oh, yes. The Hobbs, the 365-day cycle, and the Tzolk'in, the 260-day sacred calendar, are still used by many communities for farming, for ceremonies, for understanding time. Guatemala even includes Tzolk'in teachings in schools now.
Wow. Recognizing its enduring value.
And the accuracy of their ancient astronomy that underpinned the calendar is still astounding. Modern studies, like at the observatory in Chichen Itza, keep confirming how precisely they tracked celestial movements.
So wrapping this all up, the Maya disappearance is really a myth. The reality is far more complex and honestly more interesting.
Definitely. It seems the abandonment of the great classic cities was driven by a perfect storm, likely a combination of severe environmental stress, especially drought made worse by deforestation, escalating warfare and political breakdown, and simmering socioeconomic tensions.
A convergence of factors.
Exactly. While those esoteric theories capture the imagination, the weight of evidence points squarely at that complex interplay. But the most crucial part is remembering the Maya endured. Their legacy isn't just ruins. It's in the millions of descendants, the living languages, the continuing traditions. It was a profound transformation, not an ending.
This has been fascinating. It really shifts the perspective from a simple mystery to a complex story of societal change, environmental limits, conflict, and incredible human resilience. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. And perhaps that's the final thought for our listeners. When we look at the Maya experience, the challenges of sustainability, the fragility of complex societies facing environmental shocks and internal conflict, what lessons resonate today? How can understanding their past, the real story, not the myth, help us navigate our own complex present? The Maya story isn't finished. It continues through the people today and the ongoing work to understand their incredible journey.